Just over 30 years ago, the Berlin Wall fell. Historians, political scientists, journalists, and others have long used this to mark a significant change in Europe and the world. This week, on the Hour of History, I, your host, Stephen Bauman, talk with Dr. Hope Harrison about her new book, After the Berlin Wall, Memory and the Making of the New Germany, 1989 to Present. Her book was recently published by Cambridge University Press, and Dr. Harrison is currently an associate professor of history and international affairs in the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. She's won a number of fellowships from Fulbright, the Wilson Center, the American Academy in Berlin, among others. There's more information, as always, at hourofhistory.com, so sit back, relax, and enjoy, whether you are in Germany, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa, or any of the many countries where we have listeners on the Hour of History podcast. It's our pleasure to bring great new episodes to you every week. On the Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. Enjoy.
You're listening to the Hour of History podcast, Our World.
Anytime, any place.
For show notes, the Hour of History blog, and more, head over to hourofhistory.com. For book recommendations about topics mentioned during the podcast, head over to hourofhistory.com/rex. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. Without further delay, the Hour of History starts right now.
Hello, Dr. Hope Harrison. You've just written this great book about the Berlin Wall. Welcome to the Hour of History.
Thank you very much for inviting me to join you, Stephen.
So before we begin and get to sort of the content and the deeper issues inside your book, After the Berlin Wall, Memory and the Making of the New Germany, 1989 to Present, how about you just give the readers a little introduction, or the listeners, an introduction, and tell us how you sort of got interested in Germany.
Sure. Well, I was absolutely fascinated in a sort of terrible way, but how on earth could a city be divided by a wall? I mean, that is so dramatic. You know, Berlin is, one of the world's major cities, and suddenly to be divided by a wall. And so I really wanted to understand that. And the first book I wrote was actually about the building of the wall in 1961. That was called Driving the Soviets Up the Wall. And it told the story of the decision to build the wall. And the book we're talking about today, I couldn't let go of the Berlin Wall. So I wanted to understand, how has Germany grappled with this major event in its history and the lives of people? How have they been coming to terms with it since it fell 30 years ago?
That's fantastic. And one of the things I really appreciate just from that intro is you can see how a true scholar sort of approaches these things, like just asking the important questions. I mean, it is an extraordinary thing. You have Berlin split with a wall. So I appreciate that very much. So how did you start approaching these questions? They're massive questions.
Yes, that's for sure. So I worked in archives, read lots of document collections, read debates in the media. I attended ceremonies in Berlin that were held with political officials on the anniversaries of the building of the wall on August 13th and the fall of the wall on November 9th. But I also interviewed more than 100 Germans who have had something to do with the way in which the Berlin Wall is remembered in public spaces in Germany. So these aren't just sort of regular citizens wondering, hey, what was your experience with the wall? This was people who have had an impact on places like the National Berlin Wall Memorial, where about 1 million people every year go to that site to learn about the history. So, I was basically interested in who gets to tell the story about the Berlin Wall in public places and spaces and moments in Berlin.
And so you must have some extraordinary stories yourself from talking to so many people about such really powerful stuff.
Yes, exactly. And I really present those stories in this book because, history, it's made up by us. It's individuals. And so getting a real sense of particular people who have had some influence on this. So I'd love to tell you a couple of those stories.
Sure, I think that'd be fascinating to hear.
Okay.
Do you want to dive in with some of the most interesting stories?
Sure. Well, one of them, when the Berlin Wall fell, the Germans were, of course, thinking, okay, let's get rid of it. And they were pretty surprised to see the incredible interest by non-Germans who wanted pieces of the wall, some of whom not only wanted to come to Berlin, and peck off their little piece of the wall, but companies, former presidents, businesses, schools who wanted, in fact, to buy a piece of the wall, an entire segment of the wall, which was about 12 feet tall and weighed several tons. And so one of the most fascinating stories was meeting with the communist official, the East German communist official, who suddenly had a very different mission he was supposed to carry out. Namely, a few months after the fall of the wall, he was supposed to go to the capitalist city of Monte Carlo and auction off pieces of the wall to the highest bidder. And they made over 2 million marks doing that. So he certainly never expected, when he, became part of the East German communist government, A, that the wall would fall in his lifetime, but B, that he would be in charge of selling it to the capitalists.
Amazing. Now, was this grab for the wall? That's obviously very deep with historical memory and things like that. What do you think the attraction for people was? Did people scoop it up because they knew it would have value later on? Did it have personal value? Why did people want a piece of a wall?
Yeah, great question. I think it's because it was such a historical object, and it is not every day that you can have a piece of something that has played such a major role in history. And as it turned out, in fact, two very contradictory roles. So on the one hand, for the 28 years the wall stood, it represented the Cold War. It represented the sort of the place that the world was essentially stuck in this standoff between East and West. It also, of course, represented communism, the repression of communism, the fact that the East German communist regime built this wall to keep its people in. It was not to keep people out, even though they pretended it was. Every part of the brutal so-called death strip of the Berlin Wall was directed inwards. So on the one hand, it represented all these sort of terrible kind of evil things and a whole period in world history. On the other hand, on November 9th, when it fell, and it fell peacefully, suddenly the wall represented freedom. And so to hold in your hand this thing that represented both was, seemed to feel profoundly significant for many people. And I think maybe they felt it made them be some part of history by being able to have some of the Berlin Wall.
And now you mentioned that you have a long history with the wall as well, and you wrote your first book about the building of the wall. What was your sort of interaction with these moments as they happened and the immediate aftermath?
Well, as it happens, first of all, let's make sure everybody knows that, well, two things as key background. The Berlin Wall was never one wall. It was always two walls with a wide so-called death strip in between that included armed guards who were told to stop people from escaping by any means necessary, up to and including shooting at them. It included bright lights, guard dogs, tripwires to signal guards and guard towers that someone was trespassing in that zone. So the Berlin Wall itself was this whole border area, with an outer wall and an inner wall and all these border installations in between. It is also important to know that over the 28 years the wall stood, so far researchers have found evidence that 140 people were killed trying to cross that border. There were many more killed trying to cross the much longer border between East Germany and West Germany, as opposed to just the border in Berlin. So the other background is what actually happened 30 years ago on November 9th, 1989, why it opened. It wasn't planned, and in fact, it was a mistake made by a senior East German official. Crazy though that sounds. So the East German regime was under pressure from Gorbachev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union, who had been making reforms. Neighboring Poland had been making reforms. And in fact, the Solidarity Trade Union that became a political movement basically threw out the Communist Party. And there were a lot of people in East Germany who wanted change as well. And of course, one of the things they wanted was freedom of travel. So on the night of November 9th, the East German regime had been planning to change the very restrictive regulations on people being able to travel. You had to have permission to travel to the West. Now, what this official, Günter Schabowski, was supposed to say was that as of the following day, you still had to apply for a visa to leave the country to visit the West. But basically, he was supposed to say, trust us, we're gonna approve many more of these than we have in the past. Instead, when he was asked, when he said, oh, we're changing the border regulations and people are going to be able to travel, at a live press conference, an international press conference, and somebody said, well, what does this mean for the Berlin Wall? Does it include the Berlin Wall? And he said, yes, it includes the Berlin Wall. And then someone said, well, when does this take effect? And he looked down at his notes and in this sort of confused, frantic way. And then he looked up and he said, immediately, which wasn't true, but became true. Over the next 4.5 hours, East German citizens started heading to the crossing points in the wall. And the guards there had no orders. They tried to figure out what to do. And finally, after 4.5 hours of more and more, thousands of East Germans heading to the wall and saying, you know, let us through to West Berlin. Finally, Harold Jaeger, who was on duty at one of the crossing points of Bornholmer Strasse, gave up and he opened the crossing point so that people could go through, and other people followed him.
Wow. And So I'm sorry to interrupt. I mean, I hope we'll get back to your story too, but there's so much there that we should talk about. Um,
Yes.
yeah, an extraordinary story. I imagine that if it was done on a live press conference, the border crossing guards, both sides, West and East Germany, if it didn't get any memos.
Exactly. And the guy I was just talking about, Harold Jaeger, was eating his dinner. The press conference was from like 6 to 7 p.m. He was eating his dinner, and as he later said, he almost choked on what he was eating when he heard Günter Schabowski say, yeah, the Berlin Wall is open immediately.
And I mean, we have all these sort of horrific stories of, totalitarian regimes clamping down when things go like this, when things go the wrong way and situations are out of control. Was there a point to where the border guards attempted to stop the people?
No, no. And you are so right to mention how it could have gone the other way, because that's what happened a few months earlier in China. Of course, June 1989 was the massacre at Tiananmen Square, where in response to the students calling for democracy and camped out in the square, the government cracked down brutally. And the East German regime in the fall of 1989, as more and more people were taking to the streets, pointedly said that they admired the communists, the Chinese regime, trying to deter people from taking to the streets. So it was quite extraordinary that, I mean, in the case of that particular official, Harold Jaeger, who was in charge that night, he later said, look, there were a few of us at the checkpoint. Okay, yeah, we were armed, but there were just a few of us compared with thousands of people saying, didn't you see? And of course, he had seen the press conference. And, he and then others decided, there was just no way against these thousands of people who were peaceful, that, the cat was out of the bag, basically.
I can't imagine the fear they must have felt for retribution, right? Because soldiers are taught to follow orders.
Exactly.
Yeah, it seems like an extraordinary kind of decision. You mentioned the death strip too. There must have been setting off all sorts of alarms. Were there dogs and wires being tripped? It must have been chaos.
Well, no, because there were several official crossing points in the wall. The most famous, of course, was Checkpoint Charlie. In Berlin. That was for non-Germans to move in and out. But the one I'm talking about was for Germans at Bornholmer Strasse. And so these were, roads with barriers across them. But I mean, they were places where if you had permission, you were allowed to cross. This was not, those every place in between these official crossing points was the death strip I talked about. But at these people were safe walking across or driving across in their old pollution emitting Trabants.
Yeah. And now this is what's happening. It's all happening very fast on that night. You're part of the international sort of academic reaction, are you not? How were you seeing it happen?
Yeah, but there's, in fact, I don't know if I don't know if you know my personal story, leaving aside the academics for a minute, although it's related. I was on a plane headed to Berlin when the wall fell. So I was a graduate student at Columbia writing my dissertation on the Berlin Wall. And I boarded a plane on November 9th when nothing had happened. I touched down in Frankfurt to get the commuter flight to Berlin. You couldn't fly directly to Berlin during the Cold War. You had to fly to West Germany and then to West Berlin. And when I got on the commuter flight, everyone was reading newspapers with these banner headlines. It said, Die Mauer is offen, the wall is open. And I wondered, what is going on? And then the pilot got on the intercom and said, ladies and gentlemen, in case you haven't heard, the Berlin Wall fell last night and we are flying into history.
Oh, what a flight to remember.
Yes. So I was there. I then was in Berlin, primarily West Berlin, but I went a few times into East Berlin for the following 10 amazing days.
And so the systems had not been worked out. So there was confusion still in this sort of moment. There's all these sort of grand statements about what's happening, like the one you just presented, flying into history, and these, like, the triumph of freedom.
Yes.
What is the sense? Is there sort of a uniform sense about this, or your book talks more about sort of these contested histories, right?
Absolutely. So in the years since then, there's, it's almost become increasingly contested what exactly happened and what the connection was between what happened then and ultimate German unification, and then sort of, what's happened over the past 30 years since then. Lots of, unfortunately, in this 30th anniversary year, disagreements in Germany. So for one thing, among former East Germans, there has been quite an intense argument in the past few months, basically about who should take credit for the wonderful, peaceful fall of the wall. And, there's some people who say it was the pressure from all the people who took to the streets, the East German citizens who in increasing numbers from September to October, November, who took to the streets in peaceful demonstrations, demanding change. And that pressure ultimately somehow contributed to first making the regime change its border regulations, and then, ultimately leading people at the border to open it. There are others who say, no, some people were marching on the streets, but the vast majority of East Germans were sitting at home, too scared to go out onto the streets and march and protest. And they were just sort of waiting to see what would happen. Instead, this argument says it was the small number of organized dissidents who were so important in the fall of 1989. So there's a debate about that. But then neither of those really takes into account the role of that man, Harold Jaeger, and others who essentially gave up power peacefully. That's another part of understanding what happened back then. So, everybody kind of, because it became this iconic moment, not only in German history, but in European and world history, sort of everybody wants to take credit for it.
And
including Americans, of course.
Yeah, I was wondering where Americans and sort of the West are going to or come in. I think it's really interesting too, because you have all these outside forces, and you sort of started the background information with that, talking about Gorbachev and solidarity and sort of changes that were happening all over Europe. In fact, I was just traveling in Georgia, in Tbilisi, and of course, like most places in Europe, there's a slab of the wall in the center of the city.
Interesting, yes.
And so maybe you can speak a little bit about the sort of memory outside of the East.
Yes. Well, first, let me say there's a very, very specific reason why Georgia would have a piece of the wall. Gorbachev's foreign minister, Eduard Shevardnadze, who was, hand in glove with Gorbachev and everything they did to help end the Cold War. Shevardnadze was from Georgia and played a key role in the peaceful response to the fall of the wall, a key role in ultimately allowing German unification. So it makes great sense that there's a piece of the wall in the capital of Georgia. Yeah. So the Poles, however, and the Hungarians have been very frustrated at all the global attention to the fall of the Berlin Wall as being sort of the key moment people know about and talk about from 1989, as being like the moment when people think, okay, the fall of the wall on November 9th, 1989 was the fall of communism. It was, the end of the Cold War. This drives the Poles and the Hungarians fairly nuts, because it was the Hungarians who in May of 1989, so months before the wall opened, the Hungarians opened their barbed wire border with Austria, thus being the first country behind the Iron Curtain that, literally opened the Iron Curtain to the West. And in fact, when they did that, thousands of East Germans started leaving to go on vacation to Hungary, except they never came back because their real goal was to get across that border and into Austria and ultimately to West Germany. So the Hungarians have been frustrated, and the Poles, who had formed this trade union, the anti-communist, anti-government trade union of Solidarity in 1980, and then sort of brought it back after they had been imprisoned, sort of came back in the late 80s, and in 89 forced roundtable talks with the government, and then free elections, and ultimately they won those. So both the Poles and the Hungarians feel that they took the first steps in bringing down the Iron Curtain, but all the attention goes to the Germans.
And you can see this sort of tension already with historical memory, which is one of the reasons it makes it so fascinating. Not to mention the regimes change relatively quickly. What is the shift that happens after, and how is that remembered? So someone who's empowered, maybe even a border patrol guard we could use as an example, suddenly loses their job or has to work within a new government. Do they become a sort of victim then, or are they sort of they used to be the sort of enemy and now they're not an enemy? How did that work?
Yes, and it's interesting. Use the past tense, which makes sense. It's something that, happened a long time ago, but the results are still so present that it's actually an ongoing contentious issue how some people in the former East of Germany feel about how they've been treated. So after the fall of the wall, it was not initially clear what would happen, but increasingly more and more East Germans kept going to the West, and then it became more and more people started saying, well, gee, maybe we want unification. Maybe we want more than just reforms. We want unification. So, and there were free elections in March of 1990, and the East Germans voted for sort of a fast track toward unification with West Germany, which took place in October of 1990. So since then, your question, Stephen, is a really good one. How have people, particularly who were part of the East German regime, what's that been like for them in the new Germany? So the higher ups were largely put on trial for the deaths at the Berlin Wall, as were individual border soldiers and people sort of in the middle of the chain of command. These were the main trials, which ran from 1991 to 2004, and about 500 people were put on trial. Now, the former leaders all argued, most of them, this is victor's justice. This is not right. You're judging us by your standards. We were just protecting our border. We were a sovereign regime. It was our right to do it. We're very sorry that people were killed, but it was the Cold War. We were at the front line. Essentially, don't blame us. Up and down the command, and certainly the border soldiers, even when they said, and there were documents, because the East German secret police kept very good documents on all of this, so the prosecutors could use those documents. So even when they had all the proof, and the border soldiers said, yes, I did it, but I was following orders. I was doing what I was supposed to do, and I was afraid if I didn't do that, I would get in a lot of trouble. So ultimately, most of the border soldiers were given commuted sentences, which made people who lost someone at the wall very angry. One of the stories I tell in my book is about one particular person, Michael Schmidt, who tried to escape in 1984 at the age of 20, across the wall from East Berlin to West Berlin, and was shot by two border soldiers who were his same age. Well, one was 20, one was 23. They fired 50 shots. One of them went through his back into his lung. And he died a few hours later. And Michael Schmidt's father, Horst Schmidt, took this on. When the wall fell, he couldn't celebrate the way so many other people could because he didn't have his son. And when Germany united, he worked with public prosecutors because he said he wanted justice for his son. So you can imagine that when the two border soldiers got commuted sentences, he was very angry and said, well, yeah, you can blame their superiors, but their superiors didn't pull the trigger that killed my son.
It's kind of extraordinary to think about these memories that linger on. Of course, history doesn't stop when a new regime takes hold, but especially in Germany, that had seen sort of two, massively totalitarian regimes, at least in East Germany, in the century. Germany's often lauded in the West for its response to the Holocaust. And, just today, Angela Merkel was at Auschwitz visiting, which is kind of an extraordinary thing if you think about it, at least unprecedented in a lot of places that have had these terrible situations and genocide and things like that. Is there any sort of comparison that people mention when you talk to them, or is this situation totally different from, say, World War II?
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up because, in fact, a lot of my book grapples with this question of the intertwining of Germany dealing with the Holocaust past and the communist past. So I've interviewed many people about that, and a fair amount of my book is devoted to that very question. Because you're so right that Germany is quite a unique case in the way they have come face to face, not hiding from the brutality of the Holocaust, and recognized it, acknowledged it, have a massive Holocaust memorial in the heart of Berlin. I mean, it would be the equivalent in the US of having probably two massive monuments on the wall, not on the mall, not museums, but monuments to slavery and everyone who suffered because of slavery, and to what we did to the Native Americans. That's the equivalent of what Germany has done, just face to face with that past, with memorials, with describing it in textbooks for kids to learn, really making restitution for families and their survivors, all of that. So one of the things that I was so interested in was to figure out, okay, so now that Germany's done that, so in such an elaborate, comprehensive way, grappled with the Holocaust, what do they do with this other, the 40 years of the communist regime, and all the victims of that regime and the things that went on? And in fact, it's been complicated adding a new set of perpetrators and victims to be remembered, to be commemorated, to be investigated, and to put public money into remembering that part of their history. So at first, there was a lot of resistance. And even, to be perfectly frank, when I started working on this book in the mid-2000s, there were particularly people from West Germany, which had, for at least the final 2 decades of its existence, had grappled very deeply with the Holocaust. People from the West, when they found out I was working on this book about how Germany's dealt with the wall since it fell, they sort of looked at me in this critical way and said, well, why are you doing that? Why aren't you looking at the Holocaust? And I said, well, other people have done that and are doing that. I'm just working on a different topic.
Interesting.
But there were definitely some people that felt, including in the Bundestag, apropos of providing funds for memorials to victims, there were definitely some people who felt, if we bring in any other set of victims and another dictatorship in our past, it's gonna seem that it relativizes the Holocaust and the Nazis. So there were intense debates, which I describe in my book, in Parliament. I mean, this is the equivalent of if in the US Congress, there were serious discussions, really serious discussions about how to grapple with both, slavery and Native Americans in this country, and how much money and all the different ways that you can sort of confront that history. So after a lot of conflict, with some people resisting, ultimately, by the late 2000s, the federal government had agreed, okay, we've got to also look at this dark part of our past, the 40 years of the communist regime, the secret police, the 28 years of the Berlin Wall. We need to do that also. And we need to compensate and remember and memorialize the victims, and make this a part of sort of German public memory.
Now, some of those things you mention are almost unfathomable. Well, I mean, they are essentially unfathomable in U.S. politics, thinking about Congress, like, at least at the moment, debating about these issues. But what isn't unfathomable is sort of the resistance to even talking about those issues, which we see very strongly in the United States, with this sort of argument, oh, we don't need to talk about slavery, it's 200 years ago. And there's talk of that, and you mentioned it in your book, of this sort of resurgence and this pushback against what the AFD has called the cult of guilt. Is that a strong movement? Where is that movement coming from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the far-right party, the AFD, Alternative for Deutschland or Alternative for Germany, which has kind of surged in the East over the past, particularly 3 years, and in general since the refugee crisis of 2015 in Germany. Yeah, they have said, look, Germany has apologized. We've done everything. At a certain point, that's enough. And German identity is too wrapped up with the Holocaust and our role as perpetrators. And essentially, yes, it's a cult of shame, a cult of guilt. And so some on the far right have expressed those feelings. Now, the majority of politicians have come back very strongly against that. And German citizens, the majority are also against that. But, this is certainly, there are some people who feel, it's been decades now of Germany dealing with the Holocaust, and at some point, wanting to look at something else. And in fact, raising that gets at the issue of German identity that's something I really would like to mention. For all countries, an understanding of their history is a fundamental part of their national identity. And because for so long it's been focused on a negative part of history, the Holocaust, that has meant that German identity has been framed around being very contrite and careful and recognizing this bad part of their history. It's what's been called a negative founding myth of united Germany. What I found in my book, in looking at how people think about the history of the wall, is sort of the opposite, which came about 10 years ago, creating a positive founding myth for united Germany that in fact has to do with the fall of the wall. And that was suddenly the politicians embracing a story told in a big outdoor exhibit in Berlin's Alexanderplatz about what happened in 1989, about what is called the peaceful revolution in East Germany. And this was put together by someone who I write a lot about. His name is Tom Zello. He grew up in the East. He was a dissident against the communist regime. He took part in the street demonstrations, but he had also been working secretly for years in sort of opposition circles. And after unification, he really felt, not enough people understand the background of the fall of the wall, namely the peaceful revolution in East Germany, the people taking to the streets and demanding changes. And he felt people should understand that. And so he put together this big exhibit for the 20th anniversary in 2009. And Angela Merkel and all the other leaders really embraced this story, because essentially it said, you know what? We have something that we Germans can and should be proud of, and something we should celebrate and something, in fact, that a lot of people want to celebrate with us, the peaceful fall of the wall. And that, I argue, has joined that negative founding myth having to do with coming to terms with the Holocaust, with a positive founding myth of, what? We Germans can be good people. We Germans can be brave civic activists who take to the streets peacefully, demanding freedom and demanding reforms that will be much more democratic. And those kinds of lessons from what happened in 1989 are ones that the German leaders really focus on to this day. And they say, particularly at a time of rising right-wing extremism, we must remember that it is up to each of us as individual citizens to take a stand for democracy.
Now, you mentioned in that the outdoor sort of exhibition, the Berlin Wall is this place where, it's a massive sort of site. That's such a contrast to a lot of memorials we see, which are inside or packed away in museums. Can you talk a little bit about space and memory in this way? How has the sort of form of the wall changed how people remember and are able to celebrate or pay tribute or remember?
Well, that, separate from the exhibit of 2009 at Alexanderplatz, is the National Berlin Wall Memorial, which is an outdoor and an indoor exhibit at Bernauer Strasse. Now, that street, Bernauer Strasse in Berlin, had been divided by the wall. Literally, houses on the eastern side, the sidewalk in front of them was in the west. So when the East Germans suddenly closed the border, people were jumping out of the windows of their houses on that street into the sidewalk into freedom in West Berlin. And one of sort of the person whose story runs throughout my entire book is Pastor Manfred Fischer, who founded the National Berlin Wall Memorial, because he was there in his parish at Bernauer Strasse when the wall was up and after it fell. And he felt this, as he said to me, he said, you know what? When the wall opened, my instinct was, this is a crime scene. It needs to be marked off and preserved, just like a crime scene, because people were killed here, and we need to study it and we need to remember it. So preserving authentic sections of the Berlin Wall there, and part of the original death strip, using that original space to remember it and to show future generations who might say, what do you mean my parents or my grandparents lived in a city which was divided in two by a wall? I can't even imagine. So they can go there now, as do people from all over the world, including Prince Harry and the Obamas and, lots of regular tourists, to see what it was like to see the foundations of buildings that were torn down to make room for the wall, to see the rest of a cemetery where some of which they had exhumed graves to build the Berlin Wall death strip. So using the part of the original death strip to preserve that memory for future generations has been very important. But as I talk about in my book, that was a fight. Pastor Manfred Fischer was going against the majority in the 1990s, who said, no, we don't want to remember this history. We want to move on. But he didn't give up. And that's one of the stories I tell, is how he didn't give up. And what he started is now this national site. And so this year, on November 9th, on the 30th anniversary, Chancellor Angela Merkel, President Steinmeier, the US ambassador to Germany, other leaders were all there at the Berlin Wall Memorial Site, remembering people who were killed before the wall came down and celebrating the 30th anniversary of the fall of the wall.
That's amazing. And Hope, you mentioned sort of throughout that these contradictions of, such a place that is a place of celebration and a place of mourning. And one of the important themes, I guess, or important events that takes place is this relationship between music and the wall. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, this was one of my favorite parts to write, and people who've read it have told me that they were moved to tears, which of course means very much to me because I want my writing to move people. The Germans have a grand tradition of classical music, of course, Mozart, Beethoven, Bach. But the piece they use the most to celebrate the fall of the wall is Beethoven's Ninth, the Ode to Joy in particular, the fourth movement of that. And Leonard Bernstein, the US conductor and world famous conductor and pianist, flew to Berlin after the fall of the wall and conducted 2 famous Christmas concerts in East and West Berlin with Beethoven's Ninth, including choirs from East and West Germany. But also the other Beethoven piece is the opera Fidelio. And this tells the story of a political prisoner, which was an issue in communist East Germany. Over 70,000 people were arrested for trying to escape or being suspected of planning to escape, and they definitely counted as political prisoners. This opera tells the story of a woman dressing up as a man to go to work in a prison where her husband was being kept as a political prisoner and ultimately getting his freedom. And it is a beautiful opera. And I talk about the incredible production of that in the East German city of Dresden, where the set design was in 1989, when the wall still stood, the set design of the prison, in fact, looked like the Berlin Wall. And so when the curtain went up, the audience gasped. And a really extraordinary production and a very brave decision by the director of that opera to stage it in that way, arguing that this opera, which represents Spain 2 centuries ago, in fact, was relevant to Germany in 1989.
It's extraordinary how some of these musicians and composers from centuries ago can still be so spot on. They really hit at the heart of humanity. It's amazing to sort of think about these things. We're now 30 years from the fall. You've worked on this, 2 books and fantastic books and books of great detail. What is in store? What's the next, how do you predict? How do you see things going? What does your crystal ball say about the future of the memory of the Berlin Wall?
Well, one of the points of the book is that it keeps changing. Our views of the past have to do with the present. They have to do with what we want in the present, who we want to be, what we want our country to stand for in the present and the future. So just as, for a while, Memory of the Wall was focused on the victims. Then it came to be focused on the heroes of the peaceful revolution. Now, again, on the 30th anniversary, It's looking sort of at the victims since the fall of the wall, the East Germans who 30 years later feel that they've been treated as second-class citizens and they haven't reached yet the economic level of the West. Their earnings are 85% of the West, so they're a heck of a lot better than they were, but not 100% equality yet. So the future, in this world where instead of walls coming down, they're going up. I don't know if people in Germany will, whether walls will come to seem sort of more normal, even though their wall was different, as I said, directed inwards. But how we look at the past is constantly changing, and it's affected by how people feel in the country, but also, worldwide phenomenon. So the story of history is never over.
Well, that's good for us at the Hour of History because we like to keep talking about it. So now, of course, everyone go to hourofhistory.com, and I have links so you can check out the full book, After the Berlin Wall, Memory and the Making of the New Germany, 1989 to the Present, which is a rare treat these days because it's packed with information. A lot of authors are being told to cut it down and cut it down and cut it down, but there's a lot of information in there for you, and it's something that you can enjoy for a long time. We're also to the end to the suggestions. So what do you have for us, Hope, for the Hour of History listeners? What would you suggest?
Well, of course, to go to Berlin, which is such a fantastic city. Go see the Berlin Wall Memorial, but go see their beautiful lakes. I mean, many people have no idea that Berlin has lakes and that Berlin is surrounded by literally hundreds of lakes. So it's a beautiful place. There are forests, there are lakes, there are world-class museums, and orchestras playing Beethoven and other things. So go enjoy Berlin and learn more about this history.
I think that's a fantastic suggestion and definitely unforgettable for anyone who's been. I was lucky enough to go actually in high school with an orchestra. So there you go. It is one of those unforgettable things where there's there's history all around you, and there's amazing things happening in the present too. My suggestion is to check out some of the video content of these things that Dr. Hope Harrison has mentioned in this conversation. So there's some great archival footage of some of these concerts, of the wall, old East German video footage that's just fascinating, and I find myself getting kind of lost in it sometimes on YouTube. So I encourage you to take a deep YouTube dive after and take notes on this podcast and sort of get some of these moments that are unforgettable. Thank you so much for joining us. Is there anything you'd like to add before we sign off?
No, it's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Well, thank you so much. And once again, you can get links to the new book and a whole bunch of additional content, including some videos with Hope herself at hourofhistory.com. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. So long.